It's just a pleasure just to start this interesting day. There will be a first part of greetings from my Dean of Department, Professor Scaratti, then Professor Ghisalberti, as coordinator of the PhD School in Landscape Studies of the University of Bergamo, and then we will have the President of the Italian Geographers, Professor Elena.
Hi, good morning everybody. I am here both as Director of the Department of Human and Social Sciences, and on behalf of the Rector, he apologizes because he cannot be present this morning, but he asked me to send you his greetings, so welcome also by the Director. Let me share with you very little thoughts about the meaning of your Congress, of your workshop, because talking about lines and landscape entails for me a relevant challenge. Think, for example, at the place we are using. We are in the former monastery of St. Augustine. Then it became a military building, an hospital, and now a university. Meaningful line that conveys a sort of relevant connection with the function of a space, a place. Another thought I would like to share before leaving you, because I am involved in other institutional meetings, is about the object of your Congress. Global lines and possible connection. And you are going to dive in the history, seeking to detect some connection, some inspiration. I mean that this is a very inspiring trigger for facing also contemporary challenges we are dealing with. And I mean that at stake in your Congress is the connection between science, social sciences, the way the power is interpreted, also in contemporary scenario, and the social and symbolic representation that people share, living their situation as a citizen, as social people. So I hope that the very interesting presentation and speech that is on the program will provide you an opportunity to go in depth in this exploration and achieving satisfaction for your Congress. Thanks a lot and good work for all.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and it's a great pleasure to share with you this theme of geopolitical studies in the modern age as a connection to the concept of landscape, because as everybody knows, landscape has got a lot to do with connections between humans and non-humans. And in the modern age, this is a great innovation because it is a specific period in which Europe and all European governments become to create some connections with the elsewhere and with the global challenges in a new perspective. So for us, it is important to think about the new layering of world-spatial relationships. So it is something which has got to do with the ordo mundi, the order of the world, and on the other side, the imaginaries of the world and its conceptualization through the perceptions of inhabitants, of humans and non-humans. So this idea of perceptions is, in our perspective, very important because it is something that has got to do a lot with cultural innovation for rethinking today of a new inheritance. So it's a kind of innovation that has got to do with culture, but also social dynamics, economical dynamics, and political, technological. So it has got a lot to do with contemporary questions. Just to give you a few words about our PhD program, which, as we said, think about landscape as a key concept, creating great connections with local dynamics on the one hand and global world imaginaries on the other hand, through a very strong interdisciplinary approach, connecting our territories and our local actors to some academic steering committees from a lot of international universities. Just to give you an idea, we are talking about our PhD students that, as you can see in this slide, are connected to many different projects. On the one hand, with some territorial partners like Uniacque or Lombardy region or a lot of local stakeholders. They are connected with some national research partners like institutes. We have today here with us a colleague from ESEN, for example, on the history of European Mediterranean, and with our PhD program, or with other researches like CLEAN, about mountains, about ecological connections, or historical states, and so on. So we are trying to create a research team for a strategic cultural innovation in a transcale perspective, which can create connections between our landscapes, our UDG landscapes in our territories and all around places that are connected to our university. And we are doing so with a team of junior researchers, so it's not just talking about our 15 PhD students, but we are talking about something like 30 people that are creating connections between all the strategic poles created by the University of Bergamo. One is in Valtellina, one is in the Robin system, one is in Astinopole, one is in the plan. So it's a kind of innovation, cultural innovation team that are using their researches within a strategic perspective of our university. So I think this was important to give you as a key point to start from for our meeting today. So thank you very much, Alessandro, for this idea, and thank you very much for creating an event each year. So you give us the possibility to meet each year some big experts on this subject, and you give us the opportunity to create a specific opportunity for our PhD students. So it's a great pleasure to have this idea from you. I give the floor to our colleague, Professor Elena dell'Agnese. Good morning, Elena. We are very happy to have you today with us. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So So it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome this gathering dedicated to the geopolitics of the early modern age, the second time. And the time was a period where the world began to take the global shape that we see now today. And between the 16th and 18th centuries, new routes were traced across oceans and continents, linking distant territories, cultures, and economic. These global lines of exchange, domination, encounter, and imagination, and I stress this point, still inform how we understand the geography of power in our contemporary world. As geographers and generally speaking, as scholars of the spatial, we come together, or we must go together, we must work together, not only to retrace this connection, but to question how they were produced, represented, and resisted. In doing so, we reaffirm the importance of a connected and critical geography, one that sees the early modern age not as a prelude to globalization, but as a dynamic field of negotiation between local and global forces. So, I think that gathering here for sharing these ideas and for contributing to this dialogue is very, very important. So, thank you very much for developing this process and this train of thoughts. This kind of discussion can inspire new perspective and on the intertwined histories of space, power, and knowledge. And so, please, you can. I think that we can really begin. Unfortunately, I cannot participate. I would have liked to be there with you, but I am teaching in Milano, and now I am embarrassed, so I have to take the car and go to Milano to teach. So I cannot listen, I cannot follow the discussion. I will be happy to read what are the results of this discussion. Thank you very much, and a very nice, interesting meeting today. Ciao.
I give the floor to Professor Ricci.
Thank you very much to our colleague, Professor Alessandro Ricci, for organizing the second edition of this important moment. It was my last sentence last year, I remember. I hope this will become an appointment. So thank you for making it real. Now my turn is to start our first session. So we exchange with my colleague Arturo Gallia the sessions. So I will moderate, I will give a chair of this first moment. And I'm very happy to do it. And I'm very happy, as the director of the department said, to do it here. So I wanted to introduce a little bit to our foreign professors coming from other countries, just to tell you why I'm happy to be in San Agostino, because there is a reason very well connected to what you will talk about. This place was the place where Ambrogio Carecchio wrote one of the most important dictionaries for Europe, for the diffusions, the scattering of knowledge in Europe and around the world during the 16th century. So it was in these walls that we had the construction of a knowledge, the useful knowledge of the creation of vocabularies and encyclopedic dictionaries, which had a very big success thanks to the technological revolution and the printing revolution, being able to scatter this production in all the countries that you will talk about today, connecting lines in this global systemic condition of the 16th, 17th century. So we have the autograph manuscript of the dictionary in our library in Piazza Vecchia, and I think that we always have to have in mind the history of these global connections. So I'm very thankful that we are talking about the geopolitics of the early modern age, because we are able also to understand how we could follow the principles behind the construction of knowledge and the diffusion of knowledge through these lines in a global system in our history, that today could be very good to re-adopt a global culture, a global systematic culture for peace in our world, which is so difficult to face. In the first session, we will have three interventions. So we will go through an historical perspective of international relations with the intervention of Lobo-Guerrero. Then we will talk about history and philosophy of science with Henrique Leitão. And we will go to economic and political geography with Alessandro Ricci. So an interdisciplinary session talking about these lines and these global lines and their imaginaries, their representations, and the role of science behind them. So I would like to ask Professor Lobo-Guerrero to come here. He is Professor of History and Theory of International Relations and Head of the Department at the University of Groningen. His studies focus on early modern geopolitical epistemologies, the politics of global connectivities, the politics of uncertainty, and the biopolitics of security. He has published several articles related to the science topics, such as the problem of relational cardinality, the 16th century Atlantic and the making of the globe, mapping connectivity and the making of European empires, and imaginaries, connectivity, novelty, and governance. So we are very, very curious to listen to his presentation about making an idea of global space in the early 16th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. I would like to begin by thanking you for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. It was a pleasure to have Alessandro in Groningen some time ago, and there he told me about his idea of having this. So very grateful for your invitation and that of the university. And do you ever get used to such wonderful landscapes here? It's just so inspiring and so lovely. Of course, I come from the flatlands in the Netherlands, where things are very different. As you can see, the title of my presentation today is Making an Idea of Global Space in the Early 16th Century. When Alessandro sent the invitation, I decided to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit on work that I've been doing for the last 10 years, which I haven't really had the chance to integrate. And my plan is to produce a book, a monograph, precisely on this topic. And I hope this will happen in the coming years. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a bit of a collection of ideas that I've been working with. And speaks to the wider problem of how is it that we come to think about global space since the 16th century. This idea of globality, of course, is not new. It's not that we suddenly started to think global. We know through the historiography of the idea of space that it's neither a new concept, but every time and age has its own way of understanding being in time and space. And this is what I find quite particular. There's something I want to say here, goes a little bit in line with what was presented by the graduate school a moment ago, and this idea of landscapes. And how is it we think of a landscape? I try to think of seascapes. And how this connection between the sea and the land is connected all the time, and sometimes we forget about it. The seascape is, or the waterscape as well, we want to globalize this. It's something we should definitely pay a bit more attention to. There is an intellectual problem that fascinates me and has been the cornerstone of my intellectual career, and I want to continue pursuing this line. I am deeply concerned and uncomfortable with the ways in which, since classic Greek times, we have been thinking in terms of binaries, the us and the them, the friend and the enemy, the here, the there. But when it comes to thinking space, I am particularly interested in teasing out and hopefully challenging the very easy distinction that is normally made between the surface and the depth. And when we look at scapes, be it landscapes, waterscapes, whatever, we tend to inscribe that distinction in our analysis. We see the surface, we describe what's happening on the surface, and then we engage with the depth. But we don't realize that the connection actually annihilates the possibility of thinking holistically about space. So in my research, I've been trying to tease this distinction away in trying to understand what forms of power get represented in space when we look at phenomena without this distinction. And obviously, I fall trap to this distinction myself. I end up classifying things in this or that way, and then I have to go back and say, well, does it really make sense or not? So this is the context under which I am going to be talking about today. And the last point I would like to make here, before I get into the substance, has to do with my understanding of connectivity. We have created a master's stream at Groningen on geopolitics and connectivity. And the argument is that we're very used to describing how things connect, how things are connected. We come here because we receive this wonderful program. It tells us where the location is, at what time, and we come here. And we come here in a very disciplined way. A program becomes an instrument for coordination, coordinating action in time and space. But what we often do not think about are the terms under which such connections can take place. What makes those connections possible, and the terms under which those connections are made possible. So that's the context under which I understand connectivity, and I understand geopolitics to be a connectivity event. Okay, when we talk about the early modern world, I tend to think of a world where everything is there to be connected, or at least those are the narratives that they present us with. When we take a look at these kind of maps, and we're very familiar with them, Lobo-Guerrero's Planisphere of 1529, give or take different versions. Some people even have them in their kitchens, I hear. And this is a map that has fascinated me for a long time now. And in the very landed approach through which I have been schooled, bear in mind I was born at 2,600 meters in Bogota, in the middle of the Andes, and you think about mountains and you think about land, you don't think much about sea. So when I looked at these maps at the beginning, what I could see was land, and I could see continents, and that which was contained in the continent, which, by the way, is a word that arises in its use around the 16th century. It's a term that was not in use before in the way that we started to use it geographically, which is very telling, right? We're very concerned with trying to make sense of the land. It took me quite a while to understand that these maps are not about the land. These maps are about the waters. These are charts. These are nautical charts, ultimately, which are trying to show us the possibilities and hopefully the opportunities to connect. And the terms in which that could happen is precisely what I'm interested in. So when I think about lines, geopolitical lines, and there's a lot of discourse about that, and Alessandra will tell us more about it, I tend to think the line not as a connecting point between A and B, but I assume the line being a very complex ensemble of power relations that involve the interaction of multiple actors and conditions that make a connection possible. And the line that I'm going to be talking about is actually a route. And it's a route that connected Seville, Paris, with what we call the Americas, and it's known as the Carrera de Indias. And this was a commercial route that was established at the beginning of the 16th century and worked on for several centuries. What is very interesting about a route, though, is that make believe you are one of the first mariners that ventures out to the Atlantic with knowledge that has been passed on by from generation to generation, but you're not very sure what you're going to encounter. And you start sailing and end up following a wind system that you were not familiar with. And that wind system, together with currents that you're experiencing on your boat, on your ship, take you somewhere. And to the best of your knowledge, you try to locate yourself with the very sophisticated techniques that were available at the time, adapting instruments like the help me, I forgot the name of the instrument. The what? The astronaut, yeah. Adapting the astronaut that had been used for land location for a long time. And you are a very keen observer and document everything you start finding, and you're complete awe with the dolphins you find on the way, and the different kinds of winds and colors and temperatures and whatever. And you're very exposed to the element. And I want to emphasize that expression. You're very exposed to the elements. And your experience is sensorial, mostly. Of course, you're influenced by your belief systems and your education and your training, but you're very much depending on how you sense the world around you. And eventually you hit an island, and you think that you have got somewhere. That's probably not accurate ex post facto, but you are very happy you got there. You leave some people, you sail back, and then you go back to the same point that you had left some people. How did you manage to do that is quite a quest. It's very, very important. Okay, but you haven't established the route yet. You were exploring. Once you come back and start connecting back and forth, you have a route. And a route, for it to be possible, requires not only the vector of connectivity and the vessel, but it also requires infrastructure, what we call infrastructure these days. You have to establish a port or ports where you can plug, you can really connect. But under which terms do you establish those ports? Is it just a docking station where your ship comes and actually connects with a place? In the Americas, it was not as simple as that. Is it just a matter of having a safe haven for your ship to come and rest and load and unload? Well, it's not so simple. You start creating an infrastructure of that requires a hinterland for the port to supply the port for it to be able to provide the services to that route. And the port here is understood as a site of exchange where you actually exchange goods, people, services, but also knowledges. And it also becomes a site for experimentation where you encounter the knowledge of local people, where you encounter the resourcefulness of local people, for instance, what they eat. Europeans were not used to eating things like yuca, cassava in the Americas, and many of the indigenous people used it as their daily food, and for them it was very strange, but slowly they adopted it. And that is what starts happening in a port. So you have the port system that starts to be established, and at the beginning we have a fascinating situation with the ports that connect a line of connectivity are somehow inverted. You take the port of Santo Domingo to begin with, one of the earliest ports in the Spanish entrepot. And here I have, I'm showing you some graphs from the work of Chao Nu in 1983, where he shows how the different ports in the Americas, by the way, you have to bear in mind what's in gray is the land, and white is the water. It always takes me a while to do that. And you see in the first graph, top left, Port of Santo Domingo and Puerto Plata being the two ports which are important. Later on, 1541, 1550, we start getting other ports in Nombre de Dios, Panama these days, become super important, and you have Veracruz. And by the end of the century, you have Veracruz being super important, Nombre de Dios, that took over Nombre de Dios and then became Portobello, and Cartagena de Indias and so on, develop as ports. What these graphs show us is the evolution of the port system, but it shows us the evolution of lines of geopolitical connectivity. And we can use the port as the site from which to interrogate how these lines of geopolitics start to develop. But of course, for these lines of geopolitical effects to take place, you need people. You need the knowledge resource for those people. And lots of fascinating work has been done in the recent years as to how the mariners that went on these voyages were trained. And you have a wonderful situation where you normally had a pilot on board a ship. And that pilot had been schooled or apprenticed on board ships since the age of 7, perhaps. And that person would have been trained through empirical practice. And let's say the scientific and technical knowledge that that person acquired was by using that knowledge. It was very much applied knowledge. But once you start creating a route, take the Carrera de Indias with its first voyages, and you want to service that route, which means you need more vessels, and you need convoys of vessels that sail, say, once a year, and you don't have enough pilots, and you cannot wait for 15 years for the pilots to be trained, well, they need to devise systems of knowledge transmission that are more efficient. And then we have a new genre that starts to appear, which are the itinerarios de navegación in Spanish, which are basically interviews that are made, literally interviews, of an apprentice interviewing a master, or in this case a pilot, and asking him about the different stages of the route and what they do and so on. And it becomes a textbook, so to speak, a manual of instructions that could be used to train the next generation. And you can accelerate the process of knowledge transmission, so you can immediately employ it to serve as a route. And I'm emphasizing the route here because the Carrera de Indias had a very specific objective, which was to connect Spain, let's say, with the Americas, and to do it systematically. It was not a one-off event. So we have the knowledge, the technical knowledge, and the practical knowledge that goes into the training of the mariners and the different officers on board the ships. There's another fascinating issue that is usually overlooked, and it's that every ship that went on the Carrera de Indias, especially at the beginning, was a private enterprise. This is not that the Queen of Spain sold its jewels and then bought some ships and funded this and that. No, that's pure myth. The owner of the ship, normally the master of the ship and the first voyages, usually sailed with the ship or had a big stake in the ship. And thereafter, it was joint ventures that took place. Every voyage was a private enterprise with royal sanction and royal support. But this is incredibly important because that line, that geopolitical line, becomes an expression of a political economy at sea. And that political economy is not one that existed in the Iberian Peninsula and then got imported and imposed in the Americas. No, this is a political economy that started to develop, evolve, adapt, and develop in the practice of using it. And what we end up having, and this is why this graph is important here, what you end up having in the first 10 years of the Carrera de Indias is very different from what you have in the middle of the century and definitely by the end of the century. It's not only different simply because of what was being exported and imported, but it's very different because of the ways through which this was being done. I was looking last night at wonderful material that has been found in notarial records in Spain about the contracts through which ships were hired, contratos de fletes, de fletamiento. And these are contracts through which you hire a ship owner with a pilot to go to some place, and you agree to pay certain amounts of money, This worked very well in the peninsula, where you had notaries and you had all kinds of clerks that could help you do the administration of this, but we don't have it from the other side. And this is fascinating because a lot of things came from the Americas, right? What we have for that, historically speaking, are the records of the records of the masters of the ship, the maestros, and they would record what went in, what went out. Maybe there were not enough notaries and clerks and everything in the Americans, most likely, there weren't. But what's very interesting here is that there was an active political economy at play that we are yet to find out more about. Not just what we had in Europe, but what was emerging in the Americas. And the making of the route was actually the syncretism of both practices and the agency that took place in the interaction between different forms of doing things, etc. We tend to think of many of the practices that took place in overseas sports as corrupt, right? And that there was corruption and that there was contraband and all this. But those are moral labels we give to commercial practices. The fact that they were taking place is an invitation for us to go and interrogate them and see what made such political economies relevant. And then we also have the issue of the human resource that fueled that carrera. And when we talk about the human resource, we're not only talking about sailors and mariners or travelers. In fact, lots of people traveled. We're also talking about human exports. We're talking about slavery here. Part of the situation in the Americas, we know very well, is that there was a process of depopulation through disease, through violence, through war, and there was a requirement for manpower, especially in the areas of mining. And in this graph, and actually I should have put the numbers because they're a bit more telling, show us how actually slavery into the continents, black slavery in this case, only started to come in the middle of the period, which corresponds here to the graph on the bottom left. And that is where Cartagena de Indias and Portobelo and Veracruz became the ports where slaves were received. And there's a particular reason for this. It's the moment where the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas, Potosí in Lima, in Peru, Zacatecas in Mexico, entered food production and required an enormous amount of manpower. And so this kind of graphs show us how the import of black labor took up there. And it's super important to look at the human dimension of this, because it's not just a matter of importing a good. It's not simply a matter of introducing labor force into areas of supply and demand, but we have a cultural element that comes with it. And if you go to Latin America, you can just see it all the time. It's an absolutely effervescent, fascinating, emergent culture all the time, with color, with music, with rhythms. And I want to emphasize rhythms. Rhythms also denote asynchronicities of temporalities. And what we have here with the mixture of people from different cultures is different rhythms of life that over 300 or 400 years start to encompass themselves, producing forms of life which appear to be very similar to what we knew of, but they have their own flavor. And the Carrera de Indias is about this too. So that geopolitical line of connectivity is imbued by this fascinating cultural intermingling and mix that we usually do not talk about when we think about the ship and the logistical life. And we have the issue of technology. And I know some people in this room would be quite excited to hear technology when we talk about geopolitics and these lines of connections. And it's fascinating to read. A lot of literature has been produced in the last 40 years on this, and more is coming, on how this narrative that Europeans came to the Americans and exfoliated, just extracted and stole everything and learned nothing from the locals, but just imposed that doesn't really fit. That has never really fitted. If you just think about the fact that the very few numbers of Europeans that actually went to the Americas, how could they survive, right? They would have to depend on the local people in order to survive. And they would have to negotiate, and they would have to make alliances. And in fact, the conquest, European conquest of the continent, were through alliances. They didn't have the military power to impose themselves in the way that many assume it was the case. No, they had to make alliances. And what's fascinating here is that those alliances and those interactions always involved blending of knowledges and the creation of new ways of doing things. I'll just give you a very quick example which kind of highlights the situation. It has to do with Hernán Cortés and the capture of Tenochtitlan, what today is Mexico City. It was in a big lake, and it had to be a naval capture. It could not be done by land. It was defended such way that it was impossible to take by land. So you needed ships for that. And if you know a little bit about the geography of Mexico, we're talking about over 2,000 meters. This is quite high. It's not a matter of just transporting ships from the sea there, no. What they did is that they took some of the ships that Cortés had brought to the coast. They took the cannons and some of the apparels and moved them up north. With the Tlaxcaltecas, they designed a special kind of ship that would allow for an amphibious operation. It's known as the Cortés Bergantines. And this Cortés Bergantines, through the drawings that we have, are fascinating because this is not a European technology. This is not an indigenous technology. This is a syncretic technology. This is something that was designed on the space for the place in order to create a particular effect. And these are the kinds of connectivity effects that are fascinating to understand what is it that was happening as a result of a connecting line, a geopolitical line, such as the Carrera de Indias. So that's just one example. Another example that we know very much about has to do with mining and metallurgic innovations that took place in what today is Mexico, and that were exported around the world. And the last one, just to mention a third one, is the first manual or technical manual for the building of ships in a systematic manner was actually published in Mexico at the end of the 16th century. These were ships that were designed to sail in the Pacific Ocean, what the Spanish called the Mar del Sur, which for them was a kind of geopolitical lake to connect with Manila in China. So we have a situation here where technological innovation is something that is the result of this connectivity. Technological innovation becomes a connectivity effect. And then the connection that we end up having, or the globalization, even though that's a correct term, to refer to this period as the first globalization. It's not the first, we know that, but this is how it's referred to. It's actually the result of a myriad of interactions by different people, different knowledges, different practices, different techniques, but mostly, and this is something I want to emphasize because I'm very fascinated with it, is the capacity of the human to interact with its medium through its senses, sensorial experience. I think if there's an avenue of thought to pursue further, of research further in this kind of studies, is the role of sensorial experience in making geopolitical lines. That's something that we're only starting to develop. How am I doing with time?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll start wrapping up. So where did this, and I forgot, of course, to mention the institutional religious organization that went into making the Carrera de Indias. And I am sure there was a level of spirituality involved as well, people who truly believed in it. It was also an institution of power, and we know the different practices that went through it. But what I like to focus when I look at the Carrera de Indias as a line of connectivity in relation to Christianity and religion here is the power structures that enable the interaction of the church with the people, both Europeans and non-Europeans. And again, the religious space that emerged from that interaction. If you go to Mexico and you look at the Virgen de Guadalupe, I think you would understand what I'm talking about. This idea that religion was just imposed and all local religions were completely annihilated, but that's too neat of a narrative. What you end up seeing is that many local religions or regional religions or whatever actually made its way into Christianity and are still depicting some of its values and belief systems there. So this is another element that we must not forget when we think about this. Now, where does this leave us with this idea of thinking global space in the early modern 16th century? So going back to this map that I believe it's actually a chart of water and the waters of the world rather than the land, what I see here is that the waterscape displays spaces of governance, spaces of global governance. I've written a little bit about the different lines of coordination that were used in this chart, run lines, for example, and then you have the grid of latitude and longitude and so on. What is the role of this kind of elements in the chart? What is the role of having the display of the scientific symbols in this chart, and the absolutely beautiful windrows up on the left that you see there? They are occupying water space. They're not just there for display. They're actually showing us that that is the emphasis that is being given to the chart. And we must pay a lot of attention to that. Now, getting to the point of the surface and the depth, when we look at what makes a geopolitical line of connectivity possible, I am coming to the conclusion that the surface and depth distinction is incredibly uncomfortable, because we can describe endlessly what we want about the ships, the routes that was followed over the waters, the sea currents, the wind systems, the terms of exchange, etc. But it would really not give us an understanding of the space that was enacted in the water by bringing all those kinds of things together. So when we then get into trying to triangulate what I've been talking about with what we know theoretically about, let's say, spatial knowledge and spatial theories particularly, of course, elements such as thirdscapes come into mind. We can talk about heterotopias from Foucault, and we can talk about the social production of space, and we can talk about all these kind of things. But this doesn't really capture it. We need to think a little bit more holistically to think of how geopolitics is actually not a description of something, but it's actually an expression of very complex relationalities of power that were performing space in the here and the now in very specific ways that we can really learn about. This is basically where I am at the moment with this. I have taken the Carrera de Indias just as an example of a line of geopolitical connectivity. In the book I'll be talking about many other things, for instance, the point of reference that Europeans used in order to govern these global waterscapes, in particular the Cruz del Sur, or the Cruzeiro del Sur. That was the constellation that Europeans used to navigate in southern latitudes. And that's a story that will basically show the richness of this approach towards understanding geopolitics as connectivity. So I would like to leave it there and maybe get some thoughts or questions from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis, for this inspiring and very deep in your concepts. First, introduction to our meeting today. It was very, very rich, and I wanted to underline some points so that you can think about the questions and interventions that I would like to open. First of all, connecting the introduction that Professor Ghisalberti gave us of our landscape studies program. So he started from a landscape showing us a planisphere and telling us that it is a metaphor of waterscapes. So I'm looking at our PhD students here that I know are interested in both landscapes and waterscapes. I love the way he described another voice of geopolitics, not as a description of an historical consequence of events and elements, but as a critical position, if I could, very critical geographical position, about the complexity of the time he's describing, the complex declinations of interactions through lines that are thought not as from A to B to Z, but as a deeply interconnection of human, non-human, during time and space interactions, complex interactions. So it's really inspiring. You remind me, Tim Ingles' words about lines, deeply lines. You remind me Deleuze and Guattari, Mille Piani. You remind me a lot of philosophical and social scientists critically thinking about the line in another way, as you showed us. You were talking about connectivity, causes, and effects. It was fascinating to see the map of the Mexico Gulf and to see through the number of ships, if I will, so in your diagrams, the positioning of innovation in shipping, in mobility. So a general framework that you are giving us is also how to read mobilities through time and through space, which is very, very interesting. So I have plenty of questions that I will ask. I have another role, so I ask our PhD students, our colleagues and professors to start the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Luis, for your very
Can you hear from... Yes.
for your very fascinating speech. It reminded me mostly for the concept of the waterscapes, the book from Franz Rosenzweig, Globus, that is very interesting just because he focused his attention on the emerging of the ocean spaces as global spaces. Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. You can see it very clearly from the very early modern maps. You can really catch the essence of modernity and of the first globalization that is based on ocean spaces. My reflection and my question is about the shift from the medieval concept of ocean and the modern one that is very different. In my opinion, the essence of modernity and of the first globalization is in this shift from the concept of ocean as a limit of the world, as was intended during the medieval age, to the concept of ocean as a global space, with global roots, with global trade, with global contacts, and so on. So the concept of ocean is, in my opinion, central, just to understand this change, this deep change that occurs during the modern age. So I just want reflection from you on this. Thank you very much.
Can you collect?
Sure.
Thank you.
Arturo?
Thank you for your intervention. It was very, very interesting.
Can you hear?
I want to follow Alessandro's suggestion about the shift from the medieval up to the medieval era and later, trying to postpone the same reflection about the idea of cosmos, of the sky. I think it's very similar. It looks like more or less in the same way, something that is a border, is something we can see with our idea as a border without a width, without a real dimension, up to when the humans went on the sky through the iron and then with the space ships. It could be something like the same way, also in a geopolitical vision, something that limits us, and then the place where we put in game our connection, our interest, and I think it's the Alessandro suggestion is very, very interesting. Just
Thank you, Arturo. Other questions? Alessandra?
Thank you very much, Louise, for...
Can you hear from the back?
It was very interesting to listen to your speech and very inspiring, as Henrique said. I was wondering, what is the connection between local communities and local scapes? So, for example, for what waterscapes are concerned, is there any kind of transcale scaping? Because you're talking to us about global connectivities and global spaces. I think that they should be very much connected to local scapes. And what kind of local connected scapes from Africa to America we can find, for example, today, if you go to Brazil, you can find, I think the name is Quilombosh, if I'm not wrong, the native from Africa villages creating a scape from Africa to Brazil, and you can still find this kind of transcale global connections from continents.
Absolutely.
Anything you could add about this?
Okay.
Thank you, Alessandra. One last question. Otherwise.
Okay, this is fascinating. I must start by saying that you're absolutely right. I mean, this change from the understanding of the ocean from the Middle Ages to the modern age was absolutely massive. And it was not just a technical element of being able to use the lateen sail, to being able to sail against the winds and cross the Atlantic and so on. No, it was a massive change in the imaginary that allows us then to conceive of such thing as a global space. One of the early things I found when I was looking into these topics was a reflection that, got his name now, but his name, Maraval, his surname, philosopher of science in Spain in the middle of the last century. he was writing about the ancients and the moderns, and he said that one of the main claims that European mariners made when they went to the Americas was that they were the first modern, they were the real moderns, or the new moderns. And the basis for that claim was that they had access to constellations in the skies that the ancients did not have access to. And he was referring mostly to the Southern Cross and other constellations that were not visible in the north of Europe, which we now know was not quite accurate. We know that Crucero del Sur was actually visible in times of Aristotle, and it actually appears in the Almagest, as that compendium of constellations and so on, under a different name, but through a geographical phenomenon, the precession of the equinoxes, at the time of the 16th century, it was no longer visible in Europe. But the claim is very important because what mattered for a very long period of time for humanity is how you make sense of where you were here with regards to what was out there, right? The cosmos. Location was always relational to the cosmos. What if now we have a different approach of the cosmos? And that approach to the cosmos has been changing and changing and changing. So we definitely have that element there. And we have another element that we tend to forget about, is that we European moderns, or however we want to typify ourselves, we're very much grounded in this idea of a past, present, and future. We can read it in our Judeo-Christian tradition. What happens when you encounter people who understand time and space differently, with an underworld, an inframundo, a world, and a supramundo, an overworld, and they come all together, and you represent those in caves or in mountains, and it's not something that Europeans come and dissolve and say, you're crazy, now you take a Christian approach. No, they keep on doing it, and actually they keep on doing it in our own imaginary. And the example I want to give to exemplify this, and you have to bear with me, I have a terrible memory and I forgot the name of this author, but work has been done, for instance, to try to understand early modern maps of, say, Florida, right? Regional Florida. And you take Cortelius's atlas, or atlases from the end of the 16th century. These were materials that were used to educate European elites and to educate global merchants to how the world worked and what was where and whatever. And you look at the map that corresponds to today's Florida, and it's basically rivers that flow from the coast up north, and they're kind of connected on the top. And this was used for almost 200 years and kept on being reprinted. And it's not accurate, we know that very well. And research has shown that actually when Europeans commissioned local artists, indigenous artists, to produce a map of that, that's exactly what they did. They produced a map of that. But that was their imaginary of space, which was absolutely accurate for them. And it became a bit of a Troy horse. It made it to the so-called European map, which turns out was not so European, right? Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that in our imaginary, especially in our enlightened imaginary, we have been told that we have very clear European narratives through which to see the world. Are they really European? Or what is the European ultimately, right? And what is the Western, if it's not a fusion of syncretisms of knowledge, technologies, belief systems, etc.? Although we don't want or tend not to recognize them. So what's fascinating about these two points is that we're always looking at the land or the waterscape with respect to what's, I'm going to fall into the depth and the substance again and the surface, but we're looking at the out and the under, right? But it all comes together, which leads me to your third point, which is, what is the global, really? We can be as global as we want to claim to be here, but this might not be global enough for somebody else, right? And yet, this is our globality. When you were talking about the dictionary, the encyclopedic dictionary, that was the world here. Was it? For whom? Well, for the people who were here. No doubt, absolutely. But, and it constituted a global space, which is very local. So we must never forget that the global is actually a local conception. It will always be and we use it and mobilize it to connect different things in order to make claims for the extrapolation of our culture and our power. 2 weeks ago, I had the chance to be in Colombia for 2 weeks with my two sons, who are 10 and 14. And I emphasize 10 and 14 because at that age, you see things that a 48, 49-year-old doesn't see anymore, right? And then they grab the little detail, they listen to the expression of the word, or they see a color or something in the architectural design, and that yells at them, and then they highlight it, and then you think of it and say, duh, yes, and it's always been there, right? And it's that idea that trans-scale shaping is always there. If we care to look at it, we could do an analysis of what's going on in this room, right? And even our fashion, the way that we're being dressed, or the belief systems in which we operate. We're going to find it there if we sensitize ourselves sufficiently enough to do it. But we are anesthetized mostly, especially as researchers. And here I use the understanding of aesthetics, as Theodore Adorno once described it. He described the aesthetic as the opposite of the anesthetic. With anesthesia, you numb yourself, right? You don't feel. Well, it's about being aesthetic and letting the aesthetic tell us things or aestheticize ourselves in order to be able to understand what's going on there. So I would see that transcultural landscaping, transscale scaping, I like that term, everywhere, and it can tell us things. That's what I think. And lastly, from what you said, I'm very bad at this, but I should have displayed many of my intellectual sources of inspiration. Absolutely, Gilles Deleuze and his idea of emergence and an emergent ontology. That's at the core of this. That I do in the writing, and I normally don't talk too much about that. There are lots of philosophical precursors.
But we can see it, don't worry. Even if you didn't say it, it was already there. Are there any other questions? I would like to listen to a voice from
the PhDs.
Yeah. Yes.
I hope you're not taking the PhD too seriously, which stands for permanent head damage. No.
Daniela, what kind of seascapes can you see from your side?
Yes, I was really inspired by your speech. Thank you so much.
Another one from Iceland?
Yes?
Yes. Oh, you would see the world in a very interesting way.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to ask you if you could go a little bit deeper on the rhythm things, because I think it's really interesting to reason about space and time and to connect these things to islandness.
Good, yeah. Well, that's actually, I had read about rhythms in the past. I hadn't paid too much attention to it, but it was actually on my trip to Colombia now. My parents lived there. I grew up there for the first 20 years. And I decided to leave 20 odd years ago. When I go there, I feel like a complete foreigner. My sense of what they call malicia indígena, which is like the sense of local awareness on how to react to things and maybe cheat on that and find the opportunity there and not let yourself be cheated, was completely off. So my cultural, let's say, markers have changed tremendously. Because of that, and because taxi drivers were charging a lot of money and I didn't even notice and this kind of things, and because things were operating temporarily different than what I was expecting them to be. For instance, you say, well, let's meet at 1, and people would show up at 2:30, and there was not even an apology, right? And I suffered for that. Or that you had planned something really well, and last minute it just didn't work and had to reorganize to something else. That's what motivated my reflection, that there are different, so forms of life assume different rhythms. Rhythms are the result of very complex interactions with others and one's own sense of being. And how to coordinate different rhythms, of course, can be a very political issue, but it also has to do with a continuous adaptation. I just mentioned this term of an emergent ontology, right? In a very enlightened way of thinking, we have been trained to believe that there is some seminal moment, and then there's a process and there's a telos towards which we aim. But there's a seminal moment. What if that seminal moment is not so seminal, but it's emergent, right? What if we can understand being in the world as continuously emerging? Then how do we cope with alternative ways of emergence, right? This is where the rhythm issue comes in. And I think it's very important because it helps us also understand that there's no one rhythm, that there's no single rhythm which is better than the other, or that there is the noble savage rhythm, right? That's myth. Or that there is the spiritual enlightened rhythm of the East, or that there is the enlightened rational rhythm of the West, and that eventually they would clash or whatever. No, there's no such thing. Rhythms are developing all the time, and I see it in personal relationships as well. So that's more or less a reflection, but I think rhythm could be developed more into an empirical side of investigation if we want to understand ongoing connectivity. That gives it away, so to speak.
So thank you very much for this very rich moment that you gave us, and your relative and relational approach to the understanding of such a complex space.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. So now I would like to ask Henrique Leitão, who is the principal researcher in the Department of the University of Lisbon. He has authored and edited over 20 books and approximately 100 academic articles and chapters about the history of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly the history of mathematics, cosmography, cartography. He has received several distinctions and awards, including the Pessoa Prize, the Commendation of the Military Order of Santiago de Espada, and in 2018 an advanced grant for the European Research Council. So we are very honored to have you here with us today. He will talk about following the line of lines of global lines, global Earth, and the science behind it. Thank you very much, Henrique.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. So, good morning to everybody. So, it is a pleasure to be here and an honor. And I want to thank everybody who organized this, especially Alessandro, Professor Alessandro Ricci. So, Alessandro visited my group and me in Lisbon for quite some time, 2 years ago. 2 years ago. It was a lovely stay. Thank you very much, Alessandro. Very energizing for our group. Everybody keeps on discussing, and everybody sends your best regards to you. And we ended up reading Alessandro's books, because then we had to read your book. So thank you very much. It was very productive to everybody, also to us. So let me just... Where does this... Yes. We will be talking about global lines. So this is the idea about global lines. Let's look at the archetypical global line, the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this line has always, in a sense, fascinated me because of the things that are unsaid. Let me just try to motivate what is surprising on this line. Well, so everybody knows two very tiny kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, so Portugal and Castile, not even the whole of Spain, just kingdom. They were expanding maritime, in a very intense maritime expansion, and in order, this is the purpose of the treaty, in order to diminish conflicts between those two powers, mediated by the Pope, etc., a line is decided to separate two regions of influence. On the one side, it would be the Spanish region of influence, the other side, the Portuguese region of influence. Everybody knows this. What can we comment about this? Well, the most common observation is the sheer, imperial ambition, the demented imperial ambition that's behind all of this, like a division of the world in two parts. Actually, it's not a division of domination, it's a division of influence, but it's another story. But yeah, this is true. There's an aspect there which immediately caught one's mind. But there's much more to be said. What strikes me, what always strikes me, is how it was made. So you have two powers who have high imperial ambitions. They are clearly in a process of dominance, and they decide to share power using an abstract geometrical entity. There is no previous examples of this. This line is a meridian. A meridian is a fully abstract mathematical line. It does not exist anywhere except in one's mind. Now, power was traditionally, much before the 15th century, for millennia, power was shared generally with geographical accidents. So coastlines would be used to divide power from this side of the coast to you and that side to me. Rivers were used to divide power. Chains of mountains were used to divide power. These are the traditional ways to divide power. You use geography to divide power. But here, for the first time that I know of, these two kingdoms decide to do something completely different. We are going to divide power using mathematical entity. This is absolutely striking, and this requires that all of us will look into this a little bit more carefully. The second observation I would like to make is the following. Okay, this is an interesting episode on a very global line, but was it of any consequence? Maybe it was, sheer madness of the rulers, people that rule being slightly demented is not that uncommon, as we know. So maybe those two kings just, had this crazy idea, but nobody cared. Well, this could not be further from the truth. What is truly remarkable is that this abstract, fully mathematical line completely determined the colonial and imperial expansion of Portugal and Spain for more than 3 centuries. It is absolutely stunning. On the in red color, you have the area of imperial and then colonial expansion of Spain. The blue area are the regions of imperial and then somewhat colonial expansion of Portugal, fully determined by the Tordesillas line up to the end of the 18th, maybe 19th century. It is a remarkable historical fact, and one needs to look to it again carefully. A lot of work has been made on the micro-historical events that led to this, but this is not my interest. I want to use a broader approach, especially for this audience. This is very important to understand, not only because of the audience, but because many historians, and especially Carl Schmitt, already noted, he was not the only one, but he was perhaps the most pertinent voice. You all know the argument of Carl Schmitt, so there is this Jus Publicum Europaeum, so a law, a set of order and law throughout Europe that commands the life of Europe until the end of the Ancien Régime, more or less, roughly. And he argues that this is built by a series of processes of land grabbing, Landnehmen of Deutsch, as he says in German. So you go there, you get a certain type of land, and from this, a certain type of order it arises, legal order. But what Schmidt, and this is completely new, what Schmidt says is that this process begins with the making of global lines. Let me just read you one or two sentences. No sooner had the contours of the earth emerged as a real globe, not just sensed as myth, but apprehensible as fact and measurable as space, then there arose a wholly new and hitherto unimaginable problem, the spatial ordering of the earth in terms of international law. The new global image resulting from the circumnavigation of the earth and the great discoveries of the 15th and 16th century, and we'll come to this, historical context is not irrelevant by in no way, required a new spatial order. Thus began the epoch of modern international law that lasted until the 20th century. And now comes the important argument. The struggle over land and sea appropriations of the New World began immediately after its discovery. The division and distribution of the earth increasingly became a concern of peoples and powers existing in close proximity. Lines were drawn to divide and distribute the whole earth. And here the lines enter. The lines will be, these global lines will become the driving force for all of this. These were the first attempts to establish the dimensions and demarcations of a global spatial order. Since these lines were drawn during the first stage of the new planetary consciousness of space, this is the problem that we are facing, so a truly planetary consciousness of space, and you can inscribe historically the appearance of this phenomena, according to what I've tried to explain to you now, and Schmidt has already mentioned before, the new planetary consciousness of space, they were conceived of only in terms of surface areas. And here we touch a very important problem. That is, superficially, with divisions drawn more or less geometrically, more geometrical. So what these lines, and by these lines we are referring to the first one of those lines, Tordesillas line does, it creates a geometrical structure over the earth which creates a form of space domination and space, conceiving, okay? So this is Schmidt's argument. So let's look again at the Tordesillas line. We need to look carefully because it is so novel, the idea of making this. So for an historian of science as myself, whenever you find the appearance of an astoundingly new idea, one tends immediately to look backwards and see, is there a prehistory of this? How did this idea develop? So ideas don't fall from heaven, right? So how did this idea develop? What were the predecessors? How was it formed? And this is the thing that I'm interested in here now. So the Tordesillas line has to do with, I will say, with the partitioning of a globe in just one line, and partitions the globe in two parts. And so the question is, were there prior attempts at partitioning the globe in its full totality? And in the Western tradition, of course, there were. Everybody knows that there were. But now we have to carefully distinguish the approaches. One of the most known partitionings of the world, the so-called TO map partitioning, everybody knows this, and others similar to this one, are geography-based. That means you have land masses and you partition the world from the land masses. So geography commands the partitioning of the world. Here you have a big area which is called Asia, another big area which is called Europe, another big area which is called Africa, and then you have rivers that make the division, and of course there's a lot of mythology, not maybe in this case biblical history, etc., the sons of Noah, blah, blah, blah. But this is a geography-based partitioning of the Earth's surface. But this is not what interests us, because what is peculiar in the Treaty of Tordesillas is that it is not geography-based. It will command geography, but it is made with an abstract mathematical line. And there were prior attempts to do this. One was the very well-known theory of the zones. There was a division of the Earth in 5 zones. The frigid, the temperate, the torrid, and the two. So you see, everybody knows about this. So there was a big, broad division of this. And this, if you notice, is not geography-based. It's a division of the whole world according to certain criteria. These criteria are, as we will see, imported from astronomy. And now we begin to understand how this will be made. Okay? So we will make geography independent or non-geography-based partitionings of the world, of the Earth, but using ideas, data from astronomy. This was not the most popular or relevant. Much more relevant was the climata division. Maybe you've heard about this. Climes. It is not climate in the modern sense. These are bands of latitude where, now I have to be a little bit technical here, where the longest day of the year varies by half an hour. Okay? So if you, in this band here, the longest day of the year, let us say, is 12 hours, okay? But if you go up to the north, the longest day of the year, there's another band that will last 12 and a half hours, 12 hours 30, etc., etc., etc. So these are the climata, okay? And this is also an old idea, and there were many attempts to do this. If you notice, the ideas are imported from astronomy, and you make divisions on the Earth imported from astronomy. And this was very much discussed. And you have even authors that do compare the two things. This is not clear, but what he is comparing here is it's the TO division with the zones division. So the author in this book, beginning of the 16th century. And of course, you can also divide the Earth using parallels and meridians. We can do this, and this was known. So parallels and meridians the idea comes from ancient times, so there's no big deal here. But now I have to, and if you saw the zones, the division in 5 zones and the division in climata is in its structure a division using parallels, right? So the division in parallels. But you can also think about meridians. But here, one needs to make a very important distinction that captures what is so utterly surprising in the meridian tordesillas. And the distinction is based on this. Parallels are a natural way to make divisions on Earth because parallels are directly connected with natural phenomena. You know, if you move along from parallel to parallel, many things change, and you can make a correlation. The height of stars change. If you are in a certain parallel, and then you move to another parallel, the height of stars change. You know, the duration of longest day change. And many other, even climatic, in our sense, modern sense, climatic phenomena change. So, a division in parallel is understandable, but it's related with natural phenomena. Completely different is a division in meridians, because meridians are not connected to any natural phenomena. They are fully abstract. I will be even more precise. We know, but this is subtle, and they knew, but very subtle, that meridians are connected with time. So the connection is with meridians with time. But we are at another level of abstraction. So, when the Tordesillas line was created, it was creating the most abstract of instruments, of objects that you could use to divide. And we do not have, from antiquity, any example of attempts to make divisions using meridians. So it is the first time that people attempt to do this. Now, what was the prehistory? Did they start immediately with a meridian? So you have two kingdoms, and you want to put as low as possible the level of conflict between the two of them, so you want to make some partitioning of power. And of course not. If we go to the history very deep in minor detail, the first attempt was a treaty in 1470s, 79, sorry, where an attempt of division of power was made using what? Well, now you could suspect using a parallel, because there were a lot of ancient examples of divisions of the earth using parallels. So a division using a parallel. And this was the Treaty of Alcácer de Toledo. Let's forget about the political details. They're not relevant for us here. But it was an attempt to say, well, you know, the northern part, these are lands that belong to Spain. The southern part, these are lands that belong to Portugal. Big discussion. Now, with the Columbus voyage, this all gets mixed up because the Portuguese realized, well, we will be losing a lot if we do this. So we have to discuss more. And never mind. But what does it happen? What happens is that people start suggesting another type of division of the earth using a meridian. I mean, not here, but here. And this appears for the first time in a bull, papal bull of 1493. So this is the first document that we know of where a meridian is suggested as a global line of partitioning of power. But this, I mean, for me, it is such a huge conceptual step to move from a parallel, which is, let us say, an obvious way, to a meridian to divide power, which is a very awkward, super abstract way to divide power, that I always, wonder, why did he do this? I mean, who somehow hinted this idea? And interestingly, it appears to have been Columbus himself, because we know that Columbus very explicitly said that when going to America, there was a huge change when he reached a change in physical conditions. So not abstract, but there was a huge change in physical conditions when you reach a certain meridian, 100 leagues from the Azores, west of the Azores. So the idea was first, I believe, put into the Pope's mind, or the advisors of the Pope, based on a physical thing. Everything changes, and Columbus noticed, this is textual evidence, a very pronounced change in the heavens and stars, and in the temperance of the air, and in the water of the sea, when he reached around 100 miles west from the Azores. And he also observed that there were problems with the compasses in that area. So using the fact that you can pinpoint a very physical thing changing there, then the idea was suggested. Let us use this division of this meridian. As you know, the division of this first meridian, the Portuguese did not accept it, and there was a second renegotiation, but on politics, just moving the meridian to the side. But it was already a meridian. So this is how for me, supremely surprising thing that people are dividing imperial power using mathematical objects I've never heard of can be explained. There's a history to it that you need to understand. And now we know how this came about. There's a history behind this. Let's look a little bit more carefully into the treaty, because it's remarkable in many sense. So it is said that a boundary or straight line be determined and drawn north and south from pole to pole on the said ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic pole. This boundary or line shall be drawn straight as aforesaid at a distance of 370 leagues. This is what the treaty says, west of the Cape Verde Islands, being calculated by degrees or by any other manner as may be considered the best and readiest. And then the treaty goes on to say many more things in detail, and we can summarize this. It is about a line which is from pole to pole in the Atlantic. It is a semi-meridian in the sense that they only talk about what's going on in the Atlantic part, but it is completely implicit that this line has to continue on the other side. Not explicit, but it's implicit in all the phrasing of the treaty. There is some ambiguity on the 370 leagues because it is only mentioned that this has to be measured from the Cape Verde Islands, but the Cape Verde Islands are an archipelago with 9 degrees of width. So from which line? This will be a tricky point. And then 2 technical commissions are created, one Portuguese, one Castilian. 2 technical commissions are created to put this into practice, to calculate where the meridian is and to put it in maps, etc. This is the story. There is another thing which is below, it's seldom discussed, but it is supremely important. The treaty then distinguishes between 2 forms from 2 concepts. It says, well, one thing is the possession, and the other thing is the property. The possession is the classical form of dominance of space. You go to a place, you are the first to arrive, you military come out, you put a fort there, you're there, you were the first. This is what possession is about. The classical legal concept attached to claims of sovereignty. And it is related also to the notion of discovery, etc. But then the treaty says, well, but there's something much more important that we define now. It is property. Property is a different concept, and it implies a completely different sort of control. Property is purely geometrical. It is unrelated to the history. Property is solely concerned with the position, the geographical location in relation to the Tordesillas line. So the property, you have the line, to this side the property will be Spanish, to this side the property will be Portuguese, regardless of who got there first, regardless of the history, regardless of everything. It's pure geometry. I hear in my ears Schmidt's echo, more geometrico. It is a treatise that introduces a concept of dominance fully argued geometrically. Property is the type of abstract geometrical conception of space and implicitly creates a metric defined solely by longitude, which is the distance to a meridian, right? So this is also very novel in this context. But then the treaty says, now we have 2 concepts, but what is important is that property has precedence over possession. So if you go to a place and you conquer this place and you start making commerce and you're there and you build a city, but then you measure and it becomes apparent that it is on the other side, then history does not matter. You have to get out. Geometry. A very big change in traditional notions of possession and dominance. So now we have to go to the second part of this story. So this was the first part. Second part of this story, we have to draw this line in maps, of course. What can be simpler, right? It is a meridian, 370 leagues from Cape Verde. Take a map. This is a very famous Cantino map. It's it's everywhere. It's a beautiful map. I mean, if you had a semester, I would love to be here just one semester talking about the importance of this map. Super important map. So you have this, and you just go there, and Cape Verde is there, and then you measure 370 leagues, and you draw a line. And as you know, the Cantino map is the first map recorded on history where we have the Tordesillas line drawn. That's line. It's the first ever global line. So it's a very appropriate image. Alessandra knows all about this, of course. a very appropriate image if you're interested in global lines, because this is the first time that you have a global line put in a map. A global line at the scale of the Earth, really global. Okay? So, what could be easier than this? The problem is that when the technical conditions started working on this, they started complaining, saying, oh my God, this is much harder than we had thought. So there was a man called Jaime Ferrer on the Spanish team, very good mathematician. The year after the treaties, he was in charge to make drawings of the Tordesillas line in maps, and he wrote to the kings in 1495, and Ferrer explains that he had considered very carefully the problem of determining and drawing the demarcation line. Remember, he's an accomplished mathematician, okay? And he said he had compared nautical charts and Ptolemaic maps, and we will have to go very carefully into this distinction. He compared the two, and he concluded that the question was much harder than previously thought. In order to make progress, he explained to His and Her Majesty, one needed to be at the same time a cosmographer, mathematician, and a sailor. The person, and you have the Spanish below. In order to do this is much harder. You have to have, lots of different skills to do this. This is a really, really tricky problem. And what is the problem? What's the problem? 317 meridian, just draw it, man. The problem we can see today if we use computers. The problem that Ferrer is noticing, this is a super sharp observation of Ferrer. The observation is that it is much trickier to draw this line than what we had thought. The problem, basically, I will say, with a lucidity that he did not have, but now we will see. The problem is that in a nautical chart, meridians are not straight lines. This is the problem. So implicitly, you go to the continuum map. The person that went there implicitly just put a ruler and said, well, it's a meridian, this is a map, we know all about maps, Ptolemy explained all about maps, let's put a ruler, and there you go, you have a meridian. But Ferrer, when he started looking carefully, he noticed this. Just look, this is the continuum, this is work that we do in Lisbon, we do georeferencing of maps, and then we analyze, and you can learn a lot with these, changes and errors, between quotation marks, because these are not exactly errors. These are consequences of the way that you used to make the map. And if you look at the Tordesillas line, what do you notice? You notice that in that region, the intrinsic meridians of the map, the real intrinsic meridians of the map, not the lines that you paint, but the intrinsic meridians that are determined by the land masses that are there. And you can recover this nowadays with computers. If you recover the intrinsic geometry, you realize there, so in that, I don't know if can you see it? There in that area, yes, that the meridian is not a straight line. The intrinsic meridians are curved. And so Ferrer started making detailed measurements and said, oh my God, a straight line is not a meridian. And a big problem, you can have big problems, as you realize here. Huh? Who is this black thing here? What's this? I don't know, Rome or whatever. Never mind. Who is this from? Spain or Portugal? It depends. Where is the meridian? You see the problem? So now, using computers, we can understand the problem of Ferrer. And the problem of Ferrer, you're going to this, is that this is much harder because in this map, meridians are not straight lines. So, the first appearance of a global line immediately created another problem. And the problem is, how are we making maps? Okay. And I will use, I still have time, right? And we have to go to this, because otherwise many of the discussions of the 16th century and of the problem of globality, essentially, There's much to be said about globality, but one of the things is that when you use a really global scale, that means in this case, when you consider the whole planet, you will have problems that you have never had before, that they were there, but they were invisible because the scale was too small. When you enlarge the scale in a global approach, then many problems arise. And the Ferret story and the problem of the Tordesillas line, how to draw it on a map, is a typical of this question. Okay, so just an historical thing before. In the Atlantic, so the Tordesillas line, all of these problems that I will be talking about now were more or less harmless because the Portuguese and the Spaniards rapidly, agreed to, oh, this is yours, and I don't care. I don't care, about the precise location. Never mind, forget it, okay? And actually, South America for many decades was not very important for Portugal in imperial tension. But the story was completely different with the other side of the meridian, that is this line, the green line, because of the Moluccas there and the Spice Islands. Okay? So these were very much coveted, so there was a lot of greed on reaching there, and it was very important who had the right to make commerce in the Spice Islands, the Portuguese or the Spaniards. But this depended on the idea, where is it, on which side. Okay? And as you will see, the question is not, as sometimes very simplistically is mentioned, it is not solely about where is the meridian. People didn't know how to put a meridian. This is not true. People knew very well how to put a meridian. It's a little bit more complex. Or the size of the Earth. This has to do with the size of the Earth. No, not true either. This was not the issue. Now we'll look very carefully into the issue, which is subtle but very interesting. Okay. So when the other part of the meridian became an historical problem, everything that I will be talking about was with extreme relevance. Okay, so how do we make maps? Well, I know this is an audience of geographers, so you all know this. So I apologize for covering ground that you know very well. But first answer: you use the Ptolemaic prescription. So Ptolemy, 1st century AD. Ptolemy just said it's very simple. What you do is you determine the latitude and the longitude of a place on the surface of the Earth, and you do it astronomically. Chapter 4 of Book 1 of Ptolemy's Geography. This is how you do it. You determine the latitude and longitude, and then you devise some mathematical scheme to project these two coordinates into the flat surface, into a plane. So I put it mathematically here. You determine latitude and longitude on the surface of the Earth, and then you devise a projection, and you put it in XY coordinates in the plane. And this is how you make maps. This is how we all make maps today. This is what making a map is nowadays. But this is not how nautical charts are made. And this is the crux of the matter. So it was mentioned before, I think by Luigi, when he showed the Ribeiro map, that this was a nautical chart. Very important. And these nautical charts are not, and I underline this, and this, if you forget everything about this presentation, which, you should, in a sense, do, but please don't forget this. Nautical charts are not made in the same way that Ptolemaic maps, normal maps are made. How are nautical charts made? So this is, when I mean nautical charts, I mean medieval Portulan charts. There are Portulans since the 13th century at least. Very good ones. Here's another good one, a beautiful one. Portulan maps, okay? And then, well into the 16th century, and up to the end of mid-17th century, I would say. So we'll be referring to maps that were made in this period. Okay. Now, these nautical charts are not made using latitude, longitude, and then a projection. How are they made? And it is very important to understand, they are charted, the charting, the making of the map is made by using the nautical techniques that you use to sail your ship. You use the sailing of your ship as the way to charter the position of locations. And there are two ways to do it, okay? If anyone knows a little bit about sailing, he or she will immediately recognize this. One way is by using dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is when you sail a ship with a compass, and the only thing that you do is you decide a direction with your compass, and then you determine the distance that you went along this direction, okay? So this is what you do. You just need to have a course with a compass, and then you determine the distance that you sailed at sea. And this gives you this point. And this is called, in Portuguese seamanship, it's called the point of fantasy, and I will tell you why. Well, the reason is because determining distance at sea is very prone to errors, okay? There is no good way to do this. But remember, so you only need a direction, a course, and a distance. You don't need latitude or longitude. So all the medieval Portuan maps were made using this. Positions were located, determined, because you would see in your ship what was your course, and then you would measure the distance, and then you would know. So no latitude, no longitude, okay? Very important. And you have beautiful portulans. Beautiful portulans. Okay? Now, in the 16th century, Portuguese sailors introduced something. They said, oh, measuring the distance in the ocean is crazy. We will all die with the accumulated errors. So we have to change this. And what was the change? The change was you use compass to determine your course. Good. But then you make a difference. I'm not going to try to measure my distance. I will measure latitude. And if you measure your course, if you know your course, and then you sail, and then you make a measurement of latitude, you will know where you are. It is very easy to measure latitude. Latitude is extremely easy to measure, okay? So even, an illiterate sailor could measure latitude, okay? Very important. So, and this is, you have what is called a set point, not a fantasy point, a set point. You really know where you are. But was this clear? This is super, super important. It's the only technical thing that we'll be talking about. But if you don't understand this, you will not understand 16th century cartography. Okay? So this is very important. This is what's going on. And then you find a way to put this in a map. Okay? But so, it is not the Ptolemaic prescription. This is the important point. Okay? Now, there's a slight complication here. And the complication is this. By the end of the 15th century, sailors in Portugal and Spain had already noticed that compasses do not point to the north, as all geographers know. Compasses have a slight declination, deviation. They point to magnetic north, which is not identical to geographical north. This is magnetic declination. But now imagine, if this is so, what will happen to my charting? Because I need the course. But now I'm not using the real north-south direction. I'm using magnetic directions. Do you understand? What happens to my maps? What happens very rapidly? It's the following. If you make a map in the old-fashioned way, medieval way, with course and distance, and you do not take into account the fact that the compasses are not truly aligned with true north, what happens is that your map will shift. You will have a shifted map. This will rotate, okay? This is what we have here. There will be a rotation. The true positions will be rotated, okay? Due to magnetic declination, okay? And what happens if you are doing oceanic sailing and you are measuring with latitude, okay? But now you do not correct your courses. What happens is that you will have longitudinal displacements. Let's see. This is what Portland maps are when you put there the real lines of north-south. You see, it is shifted. I mean, it's horizontal, but it should be like this. It's not. There's a shift there. All Portland maps, this is a good thing when you go out to have beers with friends, to tell everybody, all Portland maps are shifted. Everybody knows this, okay? All Portland maps are shifted. If they're not north is not up, it's to the south. And do you know how much is this shift? It's about 8 degrees, which is the average value of magnetic declination in the Mediterranean around 1280 or something, when the first maps were made. So you see the effect is this one, okay? So this is for the old medieval maps, you have shift. But now if you do big maps that you do with oceanic voyages with latitude measurements, what happens? I told you, there are longitudinal shifts. Let's see one of them. This is what the Cantino map looks like when you compare it with the modern contour of lands. Look at Africa. This is the modern contour of Africa, modern. And this is the Cantino Africa. What do you notice? First, latitude is just perfect, beautiful, perfect, okay? So, making latitudinal perfect maps was a piece of cake after the second half of the 15th century. We know this from many historical records. Okay? But then what you see that Africa is shifted to the side. Look at here, it's shifted to the side. It is not clumsiness of the cartographer. It's not because they were careless, they were bad. No. It is because the technique that you use, you make this. It shifts longitudinally your place, and this depends on the local magnetic declination. It's hard to determine, but it can be made, okay? You can see the problem there, okay? Now, remember, now just picture this. Now, you have a very important political treaty that associates imperial power to a meridian, that is to a longitudinal line. But your maps, unbeknownst to you, or only suspected by you, your maps shift things longitudinally. Can you see the drama here? You see the drama? So this explains a lot of what was going on in the 16th century. But let's proceed. Let me give you a concrete example of this. As I said, for the Atlantic meridian of Tordesillas, this was no big problem. But this was not so with this meridian. The other side, where is the meridian? How shall we put it? And this was because of the Moluccas Islands, which are here. Okay, these are the Moluccas Islands. Okay? This is one of the very first maps of the Moluccas Islands. Here they are. A western map of the Moluccas Islands. Here they are. This is maximum. So the Portuguese were sailing in the Indian Ocean and immediately started charting the Indian Ocean. How did they start charting? With nautical charts. So this is a nautical map. This is not a Ptolemaic map. There is no, how do you know? Well, for example, there is no, well, you could have a latitude scale here because it's what you do, but there is no longitudinal scale, okay? And then you have the run lines, of course. It is all made by runs and latitudes, okay? And you have the Moluccas then, okay? But the most important of all maps, where you will see the drama of this problem, is the so-called Kunstmann 4, very, very famous map. Very important map for many reasons, but this was the map that this very famous person, Ferdinand Magellan, showed to the Spanish king. So Magellan was a Portuguese sailor. The map is Portuguese, but he showed to the Spanish king. And what did he say? He said to the Spanish king, so the adversary of Portugal, he said, look, your majesty, the Moluccas are on your side, and even the Portuguese know about this because their own maps, the Portuguese maps, this one, shows the Moluccas on the Spanish part. And I don't have time to explain, to go in detail, but in this map, the Moluccas are there, and this map very uncommonly has measurements of longitude here. There's a longitude, a very tiny longitude scale, And if you measure the distance, you realize that these Moluccas are, like I say, are more to the inside, that is, into the Spanish area. So Magellan, although being a Portuguese and going to the adversary, was being fully honest. He was saying, look, the Portuguese maps show that the Moluccas are on the Spanish side. They even know this. I mean, they're hiding, but they know this. So the Moluccas are, according to the terms of the Tordesillas Treaty, under your sovereignty. So you are allowed to trade there. And, and what happened? Magellan's voyage. Magellan's voyage is all about sailing from Spain and then going on the Spanish part to reach the Moluccas and then return. Because things didn't go as planned, a circumnavigation was made, but the objective was not the circumnavigation. The objective was to reach the Moluccas, sailing only from the Spanish side, and this entailed discovering the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which Magellan did, and then crossing the Pacific, super difficult. First ocean on Earth crossed from one side to the other side, at first attempt, unheard of in maritime history, but he did it. And then reach the Moluccas, and then you have to confirm that the Moluccas are on the Spanish side. And how do you confirm? You confirm by making an astronomical measurement of longitude. And this is what needs to be done. And then return from the Spanish side. And this is why the expedition, has mathematicians, there's a lot of going on. This is big, so they have to sail here, go there, cross, and then reach the Moluccas. And upon reaching the Moluccas, you have to be certain that they are on the right side. But because they already suspected, remember, kind of ahead, that there was something going on with maps, they said you have to make a longitudinal measurement when you reach there. Okay? And that's why they had an expert man to do the measurements, a man called Alessandro. Now, let me see the drama that is happening here. You have the contours of the Kunstmann 4 here, so the contours of the map that Magellan sent to the Spanish king, and then you have the real positions behind, 5 minutes, yes. And you have the real positions behind, okay? And what do you see? You see that the contours are shifted. And I told you all about this. We know. But this shift that you have in the contours makes, now here comes the drama, that the Moluccas are shifted in the Kunstmann 4 to this side, when in reality they are on that side, and the demarcation line is there. So the inner, I'm going to put it this, the inner geometry of the map creates an effect that displaces the Moluccas a tiny bit distance. This is, we know, but with the bad luck or the spectacular situation that makes it cross the meridian of Tordesillas, so that part. So, let me see, the issue, just to clarify things, was not where is the meridian, where is the meridian. They knew where the meridian was. The problem was, where are the islands? And this is the problem. Because maps tell you that the islands are on one side, but when they reach there, what happened? When they reach the islands, so they go all along the voyage making measurements of longitude. Minor detail, longitude can be measured. Of course it can be measured. Inland, you cannot measure it on board. So along the voyage, when they went to specific places, they would go out, stay there for a couple of days, measure longitude. They did it in Rio de Janeiro, they did it in Bahia de São Julián, and then they crossed the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and on 16 March 1522, when arriving to the Philippines, which are just to the north of the lines, they measured astronomical longitude, and what came out? 189 from demarcation line. That means 9 degrees inside into the Portuguese region. And this is the drama of the story. Your maps tell you something, but your astronomical evidence tells you otherwise. And you only notice this because you are operating on a global scale. So you only notice we have hundreds of Portolan charts, and we have about two or three centuries of medieval workings in Portolan charts, and nobody ever noticed that there are tilts, that there are changes there, because the scale is much too small. But when the scale is big, when you have really global problems, then you have completely new problems. Of course, this was a mess, as you can imagine, this fact. This completely ruined the voyage, and then the voyage, blah, 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 never mind. And they had to return. What happened very rapidly? What happened afterwards? There were enormous meetings between Portugal and Spain to discuss this problem, because the Spaniards said, look, all the maps, put the Moluccas on our side, all the maps. And the Portuguese said, and all astronomical measurements, put it on our side. What shall we do? And there was a big, big discussion, and since there was no possibility of solving this scientifically, a diplomatic decision was made. This is diplomatic history, I'm not going to it, I'm going to finish. But then, and the two final slides, too. An enormous problem was opened. And the problem was the following: what is the geometry of a nautical chart? Look, remember, it is not a minor problem, it is an extremely important problem, because at this stage, all Europeans, this means the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the French and the Italians, and then the Dutch and the English, all of them are using nautical charts, to expand all throughout the world, do all type of nasty things or whatever, but everything depends on the charts. And now they realize that the charts have a very, very complex geometry. So big discussion, a major Portuguese mathematician entered the game in 1537. He was the first person to explain, this is the page, that in a nautical charts, meridians are not straight lines, and they are not vertical, they tilt. This explains it. But it was such a big discussion that until the end of the 16th century, there were discussions on this, and this you have Edward Wright's very famous book, Errors on Navigation, which is the book that will reform English seamanship. And there's a big part on what's going on with the nautical chart. And it says that the sea chart is the best mean that the mariners said. But now notice, it is so faulty in the very foundation and groundwork. The foundation, not because it's badly made, cartographers are not good, carelessness, sloppiness. No. It's very difficult to understand in the very foundations and groundwork what is going on. So I end here. It all started with the first attempt at doing this very surprising thing, using a mathematical object, purely abstract object, as a global line to divide power. And then it was like opening a Pandora box of problems that lasted for more than 1 century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrique, for your deep competence in dealing with and crossing mathematics, astronomy, cosmography, cartography, history, geopolitical issues. Thank you so much. My reaction to your presentation is a confirmation of a theoretical framework that we are following here at the University of Bergamo, which is related to the semiotics of mapping. So there was a geographer in this school of geography, who wrote a theory of cartographic semiosis at the end of the 90s. And following this theoretical framework, she said that the map is a communicative system, and this communicative system has a very important agency, which is self-reference. So the capacity of the map of being able to communicate aspects of real life independently from the intentions of the cartographers. And so you demonstrated this. So the maps have an agency, they make geopolitics, independently from the intentions of the cartographers who didn't consider what you very, very deeply described as. And the drama was related to the self-preference of the map. This is very interesting for me. Another point which is very interesting is a connection to another geographer, Franco Farinelli, and his discourse related to the globe and the table. So every time we have this idea of transposing the globe on a flat you described very well these issues. So, full of thoughts. One last topic was your description of the geographical, how did you say? The geographical driven idea of the tabula, of the map, the Theo map. You said it was geographically driven. From our perspective of geographers, everything is a geography because it's a depiction of reality. Either when you use natural landscape elements like the sea, the river, the mountains, but also when you construct abstract ideas of the realities. In any case, it's geography. We call it geography. So what you mean for us is natural components of landscapes.
Or astronomical things.
Or astronomical landscapes that have already been understood and constructed by human beings. Because they have the names, they have a representation imaginary. So it's so interesting to create connections. Okay, so I ask you to intervene your questions and reactions to this second beautiful presentation. Yes?
Just a technical issue. The leagues, Christy, of the procedure, I suppose they were not standard leagues in Castile and in Portugal. Why would they just mention league and not use the more accurate term? Which league?
Wait, we collect.
No.
Thank you. Alessandro?
Thank you very much, Henrique, for your very interesting presentation. Just a reflection about the concept of uncertainty. Because listening to you, and also when I visited you in Lisbon, you just showed to me the concept of uncertainty that I studied from a conceptual perspective, from a symbolical point of view, also on the maps, in the shift from the medieval maps to the modern ones. And you gave, in my opinion, but I just want to listen to your opinion, you just gave technical substance to the concept of uncertainty. Because in that idea of a double geometry of the map, an inner one and an external one, in that field of uncertainty of mapping the world that became global world, that is the problem. Global spaces correspond just to a rising uncertainty. In my opinion, there is the central point of uncertainty in modern times. It was very interesting to me also to listen to your idea of the modern cartography as a geometrical abstraction and not geographical based. This is a sort of contradiction for what the common sense intend for medieval maps as an abstraction normally, and exactly the contrary for the modern maps. It is very interesting from a technical point of view, in my opinion. Just to focus the attention on the idea of uncertainty. Thank you.
Other questions or interventions? Yes, Alessandra?
Thank you very much. I would like for our PhD student just to underline two connections to some contemporary stakes on what you were just showing us. Because, for example, the first stake is about new centralities and peripheries created through maps within the world. As maybe all of you or some of you know, there's a campaign concerning correct the map from the African Union, trying to create new maps for a more equal world, changing marketers' projections and using some other kinds of projections. So what you're just telling us is that the fact of a technical question is very central from the point of view of the narrative that you are creating about the world and world connections and hierarchy within places and continents and all the world. This is the first point. And the second point, which is in my opinion very, very much interesting, is the fact that you said that Tordesillas Treaty is concerning much more property than possession about some lands of the world. And this is very central, once again, when we are talking about land grabbing today, or when we are talking about lands and cadastral maps that were introduced sometimes in some places in Africa during colonial period. And fortunately, they didn't succeed in all places. So we still have some places, some rural places in Africa today where land is not an individual property, but it is still a common place where there is a right to use the land, a common right to use the land, which is not an individual property. So this is very, very central in a contemporary center state, in my opinion.
I would say that you can stop here if you want to.
Well, first, not only, so there are many leagues, of course, many. So we have the Italian, we have the Spanish, the Portuguese, etc. They use this word, but in the maritime milieu, it was agreed on which league you should have used. So if sailors were involved, the Portuguese sailors, the Spanish sailors only used such and such leagues, and the two measurements of leagues were not very different. But there were many other leagues which were very, very different. Okay? So people who were going, the maritime milieu who was going to read this treaty would use one or the other of the Portuguese or the Spanish maritime leagues, which are very, very almost similar, a little bit different. But in land and other things, there are many variations. So there's an ambiguity there, but it was not serious. At a certain point, it was discussed in the many discussions of the treaty. We should be absolutely sure which league we are using, blah blah blah, because there will be, etc., some differences. About the uncertainty, of course. Yes, look, I don't want, you are the expert on the uncertainty on maps, but if I just, I don't want to make a second conference, God forbid, but if I have to transmit what is my picture of the map, so you have layers of meaning, okay? And you have obviously an artistic layer, you have a geographical layer where you put lands, there's a political layer, sometimes you fiddle around with borders, and so you have many layers. But there is let's say at the bottom, a technical layer. And what has happened up to now is that people have been talking about maps only considering the meanings, the science, the artistry, the geography, the politics, etc. But there's a very basic question. And how was the map made? Because the technical layer also affects, they are all connected in a very complex manner, and they all affect the final object, the shape of the final object. So the question here is, how can we look into what the technical level does to the map? And this is what we do. But of course, there is enormous uncertainty there. Why? Because we can do today things that historically we're not able to do. They only had a hint, like Ferrer. There's a problem going on here. But he could not use a computer to extract linear geometry and say, oh, I see the problem, is this. So there's a lot of uncertainty, like you very correctly pinpointed, between the fact that you have an inner and external geometry going on. And many of cartographers noted this. So this is why all throughout the 16th century there's a persistent distrust on nautical charts, while at the same time saying, but this is all we have to use them. Oh, but there are problems. But this is all we have. It was an object that lived always, I mean, from the beginning of the 16th century until the end of the 16th century, even later. So very well put. Yeah, property and possession, of course, super important. I mean, you were 19th century scramble for Africa, the Berlin conferences. The arguments that Europe mostly used were, the history. We have been there and we can explore there. So not so possession arguments. This is what Europe used to grab land in Africa. Possession arguments, not any time of property, and not, of course, not any time of local determination. What local determinations there? You're absolutely right.
Thank you very much. So now it's 11:30, and like in Switzerland, Alessandro Ricci is offering us a welcome coffee over there at the bottom of the hall. Thank you. Good afternoon now. This afternoon. Thank you very much for being back. We go on with our third intervention of our first session with the organizer of this wonderful program, Alessandro Ricci. He is a professor of economic and political geography in the Department of Human Sciences, and he's also professor at the Landscape Studies PhD program, together with us. His studies focus on the monumental cartographic cycles between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the global connections of the early modern age, and the geography of uncertainty. He won the Accademia dei Lincei Prize for scientific writings on geography, and he's the author, among others, of books like The Geography of Uncertainty, Spazi di eccezione, Cartografia potere tra riforma e controriforma, Il principe, ovvero l'origine della geografia politica. So we are very happy to listen from him about global lines and maps representing early modern globalization. Thank you, Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Federica, and once again, hello everybody. My topic is strictly related to what you listened mostly from Henrique, but also from Lobo-Guerrero. We normally conceive the world in global terms through the use of maps. This is not only due to the planispheres, to the image of the world, of the global world that emerged during the early modern age, but also to the lines represented on maps. Indeed, if I would ask you just to envision globalization, maybe most of you would represent it, would picture it with this kind of representations. So, different lines that connect several parts of the world globally, composing a sort of network from a representational point of view. Otherwise, another kind of global representation could be the one composed by different borders, boundaries. Here we can see different lines of division that started from a global perspective and that had a global impact. The first map on the left is the one that was produced and just made and communicated by the United States President Donald Trump for the Gaza peace deal in 20 points. This is very interesting because we can see a yellow line dividing the Gaza Strip. The map in the middle is the one of the island of Cyprus that was divided in two parts by a green line drawn on the map by the general Peter Young, that you can see showing the map of Nicosia divided by this green line. Here you can see another line that, from a geopolitical point of view, has in present days a great impact. The line dividing the two Koreas along the 38th parallel. So we can see the military demarcation line that separate the two Koreas. There are other examples, historical examples, in which the act of demarcating, of drawing lines was made during history. Here you can see an image of the Berlin Conference in 1884, in which African continent was divided, drawing lines on it. Another very important with global effects line was the one of the Berlin Wall, of course, that divided two hemispheres. So these lines of partition or of connection of the world, which divide or unite peoples, compose patterns of globalization, intended as the acquisition of a global linear thinking, of a widespread global formamentis, based on a perspective not tied to the local, but to the global scale, as Giacomo Madamaro and Peter Sloterdijk have well explained. It can also mean a global space of division and conflicts, as it appears nowadays. We are in a globalization of emergence, of crisis, of divisions, in many cases. As Manfred Steger argues, it also corresponds to the intensification and the expansion of political interconnections throughout the world. It is also the capacity of political decisions taken on a global scale to have a direct impact on the local one. So, my two main questions are these ones. How much did geographical representations, MEPs, contribute to the global linear thinking that is at the base of a global mentality? And when did we start thinking globally? And why? Most of all, why? The first line, the first subdivision into different categories of global lines was made by Kashmir. As a lawyer, he identifies three prevalent global lines, but my intention is to go beyond the Schmidt vision and just targeting other global lines. The first type of global lines that Schmidt examines are the riots. They are, in his vision, characterized by the great historical transformation leading from the Spanish Portuguese divisional lines, as we have seen in the Henrique presentation. The second category is the one of the elite lines. They belong to the age of religious civil wars between land appropriating Catholic powers and Protestant sea powers, especially between French and British powers, starting from a secret clause of the Cateau-Cambrésis Treaty. We will see that drawing lines from a secret clause of that treaty had enormous impact on the international relations and geopolitical dynamics in the early modern age. The third category he targeted, it is not of our precise interest here, just because it pertains to the 19th and 20th centuries. And it is the idea, the concept of a Western Hemisphere emerging from the New World against the old continent. But Schmidt remains in the terrain of international law without dwelling on the cartographic origin of global lines. At the same time, he did not consider other types of global lines. I targeted three main categories of maps in which we can include other types of global lines. In my opinion, the first category is the one of the political maps. In this case, lines concern global divisions decided by diplomatic treaties, as well as the borders between continents and those among states. These separation lines were adopted especially since the late 16th century in the atlases as graphic tools to establish an order in the uncertain context of the early modern political system. So we have riots, as we have seen. I take the same types of global lines targeted by Schmidt, enemy lines, but also political borders. The border is an invention of the modern age, and we will see why. The second macro category is the one of the navigational global lines, of the nautical charts. They have enormous economic, commercial, but also political implication, as we have seen, concerning the ability of European states to accurately map the new landscape, acquiring increasingly correct measurement methods and establishing control over the main maritime nodes and spots, thanks to the cartographic developments. The second area is strictly connected with the advancement of science in the early modern age and with the crucial topic of the correct measurement and graphic indication of meridians. Wrong lines, the geographical grid, and latitude scales, which were at the center of immense debates, scientific debates with political and economic impacts. The third macro category is that of the symbolic cartographies of global voyages, of the circumnavigations, mainly from Magellan and Francis Drake. On those geographical maps, the lines of voyages around the world were represented. They also are global lines, mostly from a symbolic, a conceptual, and a cultural point of view, but they contributed just to create a global mentality, mostly in the European countries, of course. So let's start from the first category, the one of the political global lines, and from the right into the category of political global lines. The first example is, of course, the global line established with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and with the demarcation line that just divided the world into two hemispheres. This is, you can see here, the inscription in here, in which the division line well explains the political belongings. Este o marco entre Castella e Portugal. So a clear writing on that first global line. Here it is important just to focus on the political global projects of the two main European powers at the time, the Kingdom of Castile and that of Portugal, derived precisely from that line of partition. At the same time, there was another global project, the one of the Church, as the mediator for both these countries. And the Church looked at the global spaces and global opportunities for the process of a global evangelization. From the cartographic perspective, we can see the Raya in this famous map, or the Cantino map of 1502. The dispute over the exact position of this meridian became increasingly incisive, and it occupied the first 30 years of the 16th century later. The same expedition of Magellan was aimed at the exact determination of the position of the Molucca Islands, as we have seen, to establish whether or not they fell under the Spanish or Portuguese dominion in a certain way. Even after established that the anti-meridian of Tordesillas passed east to the Moluccas, the cartographic dispute went on. We also find this Raya after Magellan's expedition in the Turin map. We can see the anti-meridian of Tordesillas on the left of the map. This map was created in 1523, perhaps by the cartographer of the Casa de Computación, Nuno Garcia de Torero. An attempt to close the endless dispute over the exact position of the anti-meridian of Tordesillas was made with the Badajoz Elvas Commission of 1524. The intention of the parties was to determine whether the Molucca Islands fell within the Portuguese or Spanish hemisphere once again. The two delegations included astronomers, cosmographers, cartographers, navigators, of course, and a conclusion was found only 5 years later in 1529 with the Treaty of Zaragoza. Charles V, by signing that treaty, ceded all his present and future rights over those islands in exchange of a large sum of ducats of money. The dispute was not only political and diplomatic, but also and mainly technical and cartographic, as Henrique well explained. Accurately drawing these global lines on the map was of crucial importance for European states and for the emerging globalization process and formalities within Europe. There is another moment in modern history that demonstrates the crucial role of maps and global science in making the process of political globalization possible. And it has to do with the second type of global lines identified by Schmidt, namely the enemy lines. The Franco-Hispanic Treaty of Catacambresi of 1559, which was considered the most important treaty before the one of Westphalia 1 century later, refers to the correct tracing of meridians and the necessary involvement of cartographers to avoid subsequent disputes. France was obliged to cede 200 cities to Savoy and Spain and abandoned its claims over Italy. The possibility to France to have the right to go to the Spanish Indies was also discussed. In the end, it was established that beyond the first meridian to the west and south of the Tropic of Cancer, violence could be possible between the parties. Those were the enemy lines. So when we talk about the concept of beyond the empty lines, we just refer to this kind of accordance. This agreement, based on cartography, defined an area without law for the seas and non-European territories, where even when peace reigned in Europe, the law of the jungle continued to prevail. The world was divided, this is the point, into a law-abiding space and an outlaw space. As we are observing, the lines of demarcation of the world began to solidify and became increasingly prominent, not only in maps, but above all, most of all, in the mentality of the European rulers, governors, and peoples. The last category of global lines, of political global lines, is the one of the political borders, of the borders that emerged in geographical representation since the middle of the 16th century. And here we can just target two different types of borders, of boundaries. The one that subdivide continents, and the ones that regard the division between among the states. This process of putting borders and political lines of division was unknown in medieval maps, in which the only known border was the one represented by the ocean. The ocean was the border in medieval maps that divided the immanent world, the concrete world, and the divine one. So it was it represented the limit of the world. That was the only border known in medieval maps. Who introduced the borders and the colors just to mark the differences in the maps? Abraham Ortelius, in his modern atlases, introduced this category of global signs. In his theater, which covers a very wide chronological span until the middle of the 17th century, for a total of over 8,000 copies printed, a multiplicity of scales of political and cultural borders is found. This is the planisphere of the Atlas in 1570. It has been calculated by Ackermann that in the first version of the Atlas, only 45% of the maps had boundaries. And it is interesting to see the evolution of the presence of borders in maps. Other cartographers, like Onnius, will put 62% in the first years of 17th century. In the Blau Atlas of 1644, about 80% of maps presented boundaries, while in Nicholas Sanson's Atlas of 1658, the percentage reached number 98. We can see that in large format world atlases, typically 90% of maps show boundaries. So we can say that political borders, as we know them, were invented in modern atlases between the 16th and 17th centuries. It was an early modern invention that also stimulated lines of global and political divisions. The interesting fact is that those borders did not always correspond to the political divisions among states or continents, of course. So, some of those boundaries were created autonomously by the cartographers for two main reasons. The first one is just about the idea of giving an order to a complex to a global world, to an uncertain world. So the first aim was of conceptual nature, give an order to something that it is not ordered. The other aim was mainly aesthetical, we can say. So it has to do with commercial aims, putting borders and colors on the maps, just rendered those representations more beautiful, so they could sell more maps in this way. So let's go to the second macro category, the global lines of navigation. And the first category into this macro sector is represented by the logic. I don't want to get into the scientific and technical terrain that pertains to other colleagues, much more expert than me in this field. But the problem of the correct indication of longitude on geographical maps was central in the 16th century and later. It regarded not only the political projects deriving from the Treaty of Tordesillas, as we have seen, but also navigation routes. And it was a problem that emerged in the modern era. With the advent of global spaces, the correct measurement of longitude became a problem of very difficult resolution. With increasing distances, it became much more difficult just to elaborate the longitudinal lines. It was ocean navigation that forced pilots and navigators to make more precise calculations of routes and travel patterns. Some attempts were made during time, as we have seen also before, just to correct this field of uncertainty. One of these was made by the English mathematician Edward Wright with his different treatises about the errors in navigation. But the problem of the correct measurement of the longitude was partially solved with the Longitude Act in 17 and 14, which gave a huge economic impetus to John Harrison's invention of his precise maritime timekeeper in 1759, the famous and revolutionary H4 that permitted just a more correct calculation of the longitude. If we think, just taking apart the technical problem, but if we think about the importance of meridians and the correct measurement from a global perspective, let's think about the role played by the Greenwich meridian, as the meridian 0, in projecting British power really in a global scale, on a global scale, both from a political, commercial, and also symbolic point of view, a cultural perspective. Another technology is the one of the geographic grid. They also represent global lines on maps. Of course, we have to say that this is not properly a modern invention, but in early modern age, geographical grid became an increasing technical problem just for mapping correctly the world. As Gaspar and Leitão observed, in modern times the problem of a disparity between the reality represented on the map and that concretely experienced by travelers arose. According to Randalls, the crucial transition from less precise to more accurate representations of the African coasts in cartography occurred with the Cantino planisphere. Here we can see the same representation proposed before by Henrique, but here we can observe the two geometries of the map. So the inner geometry and the problem of the external geometry. This was a representative space of profound ambiguity. That is the point, derived by global spaces. A cartographic uncertainty that arose only in early modern age because of the global spaces known by the Europeans. The question of the grid also links with the further category of global lines that has an enormous impact on thought based on global lines. That is, the run lines, the lines useful for navigation. As for the geographical grid, a problem of global scale navigation became the correct indication of the run lines, fundamental for facing open oceans. In both cases, cartographers' objective was to reduce the uncertainty inherent in the two-dimensional nature of nautical charts and establish precise reference points which were essential for landings, maritime and commercial centers, port fortifications and commercial management, as well as for political control. The accuracy of colonial conquest projects and global expansions of European states derived from the plane of the scientific representation of exact lines corresponding to navigation times. The discussion on road lines was carried forward in Portugal by Groningen. In two treaties, Nunes argued that to follow the shortest global routes, navigators had to identify the wrong lines, which required continuous course corrections. The most significant effort to create a model world map for nautical purposes was undertaken by Mercator with his world map ad usum navigatium, in which he used a projection with increasing degrees of latitude, and yet it did not specify a method for determining the distance between parallels. Wrong lines highlight two prominent global issues in modernity. On the one hand, they indicate the necessity to establish navigation routes with certainty in order to give a competitive advantage to the subjects navigating globally. On the other hand, they symbolically propose the idea of a dense world network that connects all parts of the globe and that can form the basis of a future commercial political projects. It seems, in some way, the same representation from which we started the speech. The idea of a world connected globally by different networks from a technological perspective, communication and so on. So the links, the networks. The fourth type of nautical globes, of nautical global lines useful for navigational and commercial purposes, but also for political globalization, is that of the scales of latitude, which were not present on medieval maps. The indication of this graphic element, which has a stronger global connotation, emerged during the early modern age. For Randalls, the Pedro-Reina nautical chart was the one in which a distinct latitude scale in degrees was indicated for the first time in 1504. Here we can see another example of 2 years later from the Kunstmann 3 map. The inclusion of a reduction scale can also be considered as a global line, and an innovation accent in medieval cartography, where the functional necessity was minimal due to the limited spaces of the Euro-Mediterranean portion of the globe. A final category, and I go to the conclusions with this one, is represented by the lines of global voyages. This is very curious, in my opinion. This is an element that was also outlined by Sara Caputo in her book on tracks on oceans. And this category testifies the sense of an acquired global fundamentals, intended as this cognition of the global and navigable world. This regards mainly the circumnavigation of the globe made by Magellan. Here you can see the global line of his voyage in this very beautiful map from Battista-Agnese in 1544, but also the enterprise of Francis Drake. Here is less visible, but there are the tracks of the circumnavigation made by the English sailor. This is very interesting because here we are with these examples in the full consciousness of a global mentality made represented by the Europeans. So, going to the conclusions. For the first time in history, lines of demarcation and imaginary lines on maps represented the acquisition of a global mentality. Geographical maps became a means through which the entire globe was conceived according to global trajectories. This was impossible until the Middle Ages, when the problem of global partition lines, rayas and empty lines did not exist, when the problem of longitude was completely irrelevant. When the geographical grid and round lines had a relative weight, and when the only existing borders were those between the ecumen, the known world, and the divine one. Global spaces also created the need to clearly subdivide areas of political and religious competence worldwide, a relevant part of political globalization if we think about it. Concluding, tracing global lines on maps served to establish a new global order, a form of globalization that necessarily passed through diplomatic agreements, the one on which Schmidt focused his attention, but before them through technical skills of the highest level, navigation abilities, travel accounts, the capacity to develop new technologies, and to manage a dense intelligence apparatus, made also of nautical charts and maps. The global lines traced on maps would become the central geopolitical principle of the modern age, useful for establishing areas of sovereignty, political and commercial competence, and for thinking about the world globally, in a global sense. Thanks to cartography and its graphic science, global science, the world began to be interpreted as a divisible reality, in which the order is given by the lines of separation established diplomatically or in the mapmakers' ateliers with all the other types of global signs and lines on maps. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, for the variety of the voyage that you made us make through through a variety of maps of different historical and political contexts, giving us the richness of this contribution to our understanding of this global connectivity in order to substantiate your point related to the early modern form of globalization, in order to figure out a step forward in the evolution of our scientific research in these topics. I wanted to underline 2 points. When you are talking about this division between political lines and nautical global lines, it reminds me a lot of what we said at the beginning in the first session, in the first panel. So when you talk about political lines, I understand it as what we call it in our geographical theory of complexity, the land structuration. So how these maps, areas, and borders, national borders, are defining the structuration of the land through a political power, while the second is very useful to understand the concept of mobility, of world connectivity, so the topics that we were analyzing with Luis. So thank you very much. I ask the audience if you have questions or comments. Yes, thank you very much.
I would like to make a comment. I think what I'm about to say, I think it's implicit in your presentation, but I think maybe it should be more explicit. I don't know, maybe you can comment. It's the idea that, in the modern ages, at a certain point it was needed to put signs that also expressed that there was complete accessibility to all places. Not only that they were there, but that they were reachable, that it was feasible to get there. And this is not obvious. When you make a map, it's not obvious that all of these areas are accessible. You can draw areas that, it's impossible to get there. But one of the things that you start noticing is that they start putting small graphical things to convey this information. It's all accessible. If we go backwards, the most dramatic case is in Ptolemy, the Archimenian. Everybody knew that the Earth was a sphere, and yet you only represent partial, because in a very deep ontological sense, all the rest was inaccessible. Of course it was there, because it was a sphere. There was something there, but there was no point in drawing, because you couldn't get there. And then this keeps on changing. And I think that your travel lines are very important in this sense. Because every time that you draw travel, you make a public statement on the accessibility. So my impression, I think this should emphasize that you need also, if you want to have a complete global picture of the Earth, to ascertain not only all of those regions, not only that they're connected, the connectivity, but one step further, that it is possible to reach there. Any point on the surface of the Earth is reachable. And this is very clear after the end of the 16th century.
Yeah.
Thank you, Henrique.
Okay.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Alessandra, very much. I want to push you on an epistemological question. So I really like your question you're posing. How much did maps contribute to global linear thinking? But maps are an instance of something taking place. They give a way of reasoning about space. That's one way of seeing it. So my concern is, okay, what really changed that made such an impact on the way in which we were visually depicting space through maps? There's a very neat narrative about the economic system of the time, mercantilism, right? I think that needs to be revised in the sense, not that we're claiming it, that political history, we know that, but in line with what Henrique was telling us on the importance of claiming property I think the very conception of property is undergoing a dramatic transformation in that period which you are tracing borders becoming much more important than maps, basically the 16th century, throughout the century. And of course it's a period of the religious Reformation and so on, but what about the problem of property within the Reformation that gets impacted particularly in the Cambresis map that you showed? So I wonder if that's something you could consider, probably not to tell me now, but there is something big going on there at the level of property, the political economy of power that gets manifested in maps.
Thank you very much, Luis. Our PhD student, Matteo.
Yeah. Do you think that political border is just a political border, an act of power when reflect the community and its legal territory?
What, sorry?
The difference between autocentric border and heterocentric border.
Self-centered and heterocentric.
Mm-hmm. And when the border, the political border, is reflect the community and
If I can
possibly,
yes, of course. I will translate in English. I will try.
Quando il confine politico riflette sostanzialmente la volontà di una comunità di vivere in un determinato territorio, si può parlare semplicemente di un atto di potere o qualcosa di più di un confine politico?
So the question is, when a political border defines a land which is self-represented by a community, can we talk at the same level of political border as when we talk about external actors doing an action of power over a land? Thank you, Matteo. Other questions? Alessandra?
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I have once again 2 or 3 points which is for our PhD students. Because I think that this meeting is very important also in order to help us to get connected to our contemporary states. And the first point is about mobility and how Henrique also underlined this conceptualization of the world makes the world closer. So the fact that we try to create some word representation is already a way to get closer to the world, to other places in the world. And this is much more important today because we should map not only the physical mobility but also the virtual mobility and how this virtual and physical mobility in our globalized world create much more relationships with places that are far away from artificial spatial distance. The second point is about borders and how today can we think about a new way to think about our places. I have many times the impression that we have, for example, some data that are referred to single nations, single states, but we are in a connected place. So how borders should be also cancelled or taken away when we are talking about transborder mobilities, osmosis, this connection which create a new inhabiting which is all around the world from the physical and the virtual point of view, not only from a physical. We have some polytopic inhabiting from a physical and a virtual point of view. And the third point is about thinking about new maps for contemporary work, but getting some inspiration from these ancient maps. Because I think that before what could be seen as the Euclidean map, we were much more free to be creative in a kind of representation of the world which was not as rigid as it becomes later. So this must be, in my opinion, a point also for our PhD students for contemporary states.
I would like to, are there any questions? No. I would like to add just something very brief. Probably I would change the title after listening to your presentation, deleting the word representing, because you demonstrate, we are demonstrating that we are talking about an agency of sociality. So we are talking about the agency of all the things that you have said during these three presentations, about an important agency of representations. So they are not only representations, they are doing an act. Are virtual, are practical, are symbolic, but they are acting. So this is just a bold launch.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your interesting questions. I think, just to answer Henrique, I was wondering if name the last macro category of the global voyages as the one of the imaginary lines. Yes, of course, in her book, Sara Caputo focuses on the exact tracement of those lines, if they corresponded really to the voyages made around the world. I think this is a secondary problem. They were not imaginary lines. They were concrete lines that rendered concretely the possibility just to know and reach every part of the world. So, in my opinion, if many authors focuses on the voyage made by Columbus as the first act of the modern first globalization, as we call it, as Luis said before, maybe a more concrete historical step is the one represented by the voyage of Magellan and Elena, because it concretely represented the globalization, the making world as a global world in a concrete sense. And in my opinion, it goes also to the point just underlined by Federica about the territorialization process made possible by maps, of course. It goes in the same direction of the point outlined by Henrique. If I well understood the question from Luis Lobo-Guerrero, what was the role of reformation in the concept and in the possibility to make concrete the idea of property of mercantilism? Was that the question?
The other way around. What can we understand in the Reformation and all this about the change in conception of property that gets represented in maps?
I was thinking about it. I don't have a concrete answer here and now, but I was wondering about this, just looking at your graphic showed before about slavery. There is an increasing of the slavery process in the new lands at the end of the 16th century, maybe corresponding to the concrete role of the Protestant powers in the New World. That could be very interesting to underline as a research point, just to be deepened, in my opinion. So I don't have a concrete answer. Maybe we can reason about the idea of a double predestination in Calvinism that maybe had a role in the idea of a property to be claimed due to the predestination, to divine predestination. Can be a very interesting track of research, maybe. About the political borders, this is a very interesting question. I deepened the representation of the Netherlands during the late 16th and during the 17th century, in particular with the typology of Leopoldus maps that symbolizes perfectly the acquisition of a national mentality from a cartographic perspective. I think it's less evident in the cases of the atlases where the borders were put for cultural reasons, mainly for cultural reasons, besides of the real national borders on the terrain. What else? About the final questions made by Alessandra, I maybe forgot.
I just was wondering whether some of your states can be related to some contemporary states, like concerning mobility, and it's not a question.
No, it's a reflection.
So to see how, when you have a word imaginary in your mind or in a society, you get the word closer. So, and this is connected to our contemporary situation where we have every day some connections, some virtual and physical connections, creating our inhabiting completely somehow related to other world contexts that influence in our contemporary situation. And this is, so with one state it's about mobility, the other state is about also the way of creating some new maps that could be not only Euclidean maps, but some maps with a different perspective, like before Euclidean maps.
I think that the central topic for this last point is the one of the territorial trap exposed by John Agnew in the middle of the 90s. That catch, in my opinion, the problem of the modern, of the present times globalization and international relations. The way in which we consider the world now doesn't fit with the map we have created of the world. That is the problem of the early modern age of the atlases, that put just some borders from a subjective point of view of the cartographer, but didn't correspond to the reality of the terrain. I think the same problem we have it now from a different perspective, for the rising of different actors in the international scenario, for the folding of the idea of the nation states, for the crisis of the nation states as a central subject of international relations.
Downscale perspective, whatever is our action.
We have a double geometry in this sense. Yeah, and so new maps are necessary. Yes, mostly from a geopolitical perspective, in my opinion.
Thank you, Alessandro. We will continue our translation Scapes, as we call it now, in the afternoon at 2 o'clock here, with the chair of my colleague geographer from the University of Roma III, Arturo Gallia, that I thank very much to be here with us, talking thanks to colleagues from the University of Amsterdam, of Zadar, and from the National Council of Research. We will go on discussing these very interesting topics. So see you at 2 o'clock. For the others, we stay together. Thank you.